Modern agriculture didn't collapse, it didn't fail, it didn't even make a wrong turn. It followed instructions perfectly. For decades, farming systems around the world were pushed to do one thing better than anything else they had ever done before: produce more, faster, more efficiently, with less visible waste, and by every conventional measure, it worked. Yields increased, output per hectare climbed, technology scaled, data became sharper, decisions became faster. So here's the uncomfortable question nobody likes to ask. Why does farming feel harder now than it did when it was less advanced? Why does one bad season wipe out years of progress? Why do margins feel tighter even when production is higher? Why does everything require more timing, more precision, more inputs, more risk? That feeling isn't nostalgia, it's a signal, because when a system is optimized for the wrong thing, it doesn't collapse loudly. It becomes brittle quietly, and modern agriculture didn't become fragile by accident. It became fragile by design. Not because farmers are careless, not because engineers are incompetent, not because technology is evil, but because optimization rewards what is easy to measure and ignores what is hard to see. At the beginning, the objective was reasonable: feed more people, reduce hunger, stabilize supply. So agriculture needed metrics, clear ones, comparable ones, quantifiable ones, and one metric rose above all others: yield. Yield was clean, yield was objective, yield fit perfectly into reports, spreadsheets, policies, and investment models. If yield went up, the system was considered successful. If yield stayed high, risks were assumed to be under control. But yield doesn't measure resilience. It doesn't measure recovery. It doesn't measure how close a system is to failure. It only measures how hard you pushed it this season. And pushing systems works surprisingly well, until it doesn't. Here's the part most people miss. Optimization doesn't ask whether a system can survive stress. It asks whether a system can perform under ideal conditions. That difference changes everything. Once yield became the dominant signal of success, farming stopped being managed as a living system and started being treated like a production machine. And machines don't need forgiveness. They need precision. So agriculture became precise, planting windows narrowed, operations became synchronized, margins for error shrank. On paper, this looked like progress. In reality, it was the slow removal of slack. Slack is what absorbs shocks. Slack is what allows mistakes. Slack is what lets systems recover. Nature runs on slack. Optimization hates it. So little by little, slack disappeared. At first, nobody noticed. Because yields were still rising. That's the trap. Yield hides fragility extremely well. You can push a biological system for years before it pushes back. By the time problems become visible, the system is already dependent on constant correction. More fertilizer to compensate for less biological activity. More chemistry to compensate for less ecological balance. More precision to compensate for less tolerance. None of this looks like failure. It looks like management, and management feels responsible. That's why this transition wasn't controversial. It felt smart. Bigger machines made sense. Uniform fields made sense. Standardized solutions made sense. Every decision was logical inside the framework we built. That's the dangerous part. Bad systems don't usually come from bad intentions. They come from good intentions applied too narrowly. Agriculture didn't optimize for resilience because resilience is slow, uneven, and difficult to quantify. It optimized for output because output is immediate, comparable, and rewarding. But systems optimized for output behave differently under stress. They don't bend, they don't adapt, they break, and when they break, they don't do it all at once. They do it season by season. One extra input here, one tighter window there, one more dependency added quietly, until the system no longer forgives small mistakes. Weather variability becomes catastrophic instead of manageable. Market shifts become existential instead of inconvenient. Human error becomes expensive instead of recoverable. This is why farming today feels exhausting. Not because farmers are worse. Not because land is worse. But because they are operating inside systems that demand perfection. And perfection is fragile. Here's the real irony. The more efficient agriculture became, the less room it had for reality. Reality is messy. Biology is unpredictable. Weather doesn't respect schedules. Efficiency assumes control. Farming never had it, so tension builds between what the system expects and what nature delivers. That tension doesn't show up in yield charts. It shows up in stress, debt, dependency, and burnout. But those aren't considered agricultural metrics. So they're ignored, and the system keeps optimizing. This is the moment where most discussions stop. They blame technology. They blame corporations. They blame farmers. All of them miss the point. The core issue isn't who controls agriculture. It's what agriculture is optimized for. Because once you choose the wrong target, even perfect execution takes you in the wrong direction. And that's exactly what happened. But to understand how deep this goes, we need to look at how yield stopped being a tool and became the objective. That shift changed every decision that came after. And once it happened, there was no easy way back. In the next part, we'll break down how a single metric quietly took control of modern farming, and why it was never meant to carry that responsibility. Yield didn't take control overnight. It earned trust first. In the early days, yield was just feedback. A signal, a way to compare seasons, varieties, and practices. Low yield meant something was wrong. Higher yield suggested improvement. That made sense. The problem started when yield stopped being a reference point and became the destination. That shift was subtle, almost invisible. No one stood up and said, "From now on, yield is all that matters." It happened quietly, through incentives. Policies rewarded it, markets reinforced it, financing depended on it, research prioritized it. Over time, yield became the easiest way to prove competence. If your yields were high, your system was considered good. If your yields were stable, your risks were considered managed. Everything else became secondary. This is how metrics gain power. Not because they're wrong, but because they're convenient. Yield was measurable, comparable, portable across regions, crops, and years. Resilience wasn't. You can't easily graph recovery capacity. You can't benchmark forgiveness. You can't standardize adaptability. So those things stayed in the background. Yield moved to the front. And once a metric becomes central, behavior reorganizes around it. Farmers didn't suddenly become obsessed with numbers. They adapted rationally to the system they were operating in. If yield determined access to credit, yield mattered. If yield justified investment, yield mattered. If yield validated decisions, yield mattered. Not because people were blind, but because the system rewarded them for seeing only that. Here's where the logic tightens. When yield is the goal, variability becomes a threat. And when variability is a threat, uniformity becomes attractive. Uniform soils, uniform crops, uniform timing, uniform inputs. Uniformity simplifies management. It reduces uncertainty. It increases predictability. Predictability looks like control, but biological systems don't thrive under uniform pressure. They tolerate it until they don't. To keep yields climbing, systems had to be pushed harder. More nutrients to remove bottlenecks. More protection to reduce losses. More precision to hit narrower windows. Each step was logical. Each step solved a short-term problem. But each step also reduced margin. Margin is the distance between working and failing. Yield doesn't measure that distance. So nobody noticed it shrinking. At this point, agriculture crossed a line. It stopped optimizing for performance within a system and started optimizing the system itself for performance. That distinction matters. A system optimized for performance assumes conditions will cooperate. A system optimized for resilience assumes they won't. Modern farming assumed cooperation. Weather models got better. Forecasts got sharper. Inputs got more targeted. Confidence increased. But confidence isn't control. The tighter systems became, the less tolerance they had for surprise. Miss a window by a few days. Lose efficiency. Lose yield. Weather shifts slightly. Operations fall out of sync. Costs rise. Input delivery delayed. Whole sequences break. These aren't failures of execution. They're failures of design. Designs that leave no room for deviation. And yield never warned us. Because yield is binary, it tells you what happened, not how close you were to disaster. A system can deliver high yields right up until the moment it can't. That's why fragility often looks like success, right before it collapses. Here's the part that really matters. Once yield became the objective, every improvement was evaluated through one question. Does this increase output? Not. Does this make the system more robust? Does this reduce dependency? Does this increase recovery speed? Those questions don't raise yields immediately. So they were sidelined. Over time, the farming mindset shifted. Success became seasonal, not systemic. If this season worked, the system was considered valid. Long-term consequences were deferred. Deferred problems are invisible problems. Until they arrive all at once. And when they arrive, the response is usually the same. More optimization, more inputs, more control, more precision, which tightens the system further. This is how feedback loops turn toxic. Yield rewards pushing harder. Pushing harder reduces margin. Reduced margin increases risk. Increased risk demands more control. Control removes flexibility. Flexibility is what handles risk. The loop feeds itself, and from the inside, it feels like progress. That's why blaming individuals misses the point. No farmer woke up wanting a fragile system. No engineer designed instability on purpose. They responded to signals. And yield was the loudest signal in the room. By the time cracks appeared, the system was already locked in. Locked into machinery scales. Locked into input dependencies. Locked into timing chains that couldn't be relaxed. Changing direction stopped being a choice. It became a threat. That's the real power of a metric. It doesn't just guide decisions. It shapes what decisions are even possible. And yield reshaped agriculture so deeply that alternatives started to look irresponsible. Lower output looked like failure. More diversity looked like inefficiency. More margin looked like waste. Even when those things increased stability. This is why conversations about agriculture feel stuck. Everyone is optimizing inside the same frame. And as long as that frame remains intact, outcomes won't change. But here's the critical insight. Yield didn't cause this alone. It only revealed a deeper flaw. A flaw in how optimization itself was applied. Because yield could only take control after something else was already ignored. Something slower, something quieter, something that doesn't respond well to pressure. In the next part, we'll look at what modern agriculture systematically ignored while chasing yield, and why those ignored elements are now the source of most of today's problems. That's where the real damage started. Some problems don't show up when you measure performance. They show up when you measure recovery. And modern agriculture almost never measured recovery. Because recovery is slow, uneven, annoyingly hard to quantify, so it stayed invisible. While yield was climbing, other signals were quietly fading into the background. Soil structure, biological activity, system redundancy, operational flexibility, none of these move fast enough to impress a chart. You can degrade soil resilience for years before yields respond. By the time yields dip, the system is already compensating. More fertilizer, more correction, more intervention. That's the trap. The system learns how to hide its own damage. From the outside, everything still looks productive. From the inside, the system is becoming dependent. Dependency is fragile by definition. But optimization doesn't see dependency as a risk. It sees it as a solution. If one input fixes the problem is considered solved. Until that input becomes mandatory. Soil is the clearest example. Healthy soil doesn't maximize short-term output. It buffers variability. It stores water. It stabilizes nutrients. It forgives mistakes. None of that shows up directly in yield numbers. So when optimization pressure increased, soil was treated like a platform, not a system. As long as yields stayed high, degradation was tolerated. Compaction could be corrected later. Organic matter could be rebuilt later. Biology could be managed later. Later is where inconvenient truths live. Because rebuilding resilience is slower than destroying it. And optimization is impatient. As machinery scaled, pressure increased. Heavier equipment, tighter passes, shorter windows. Every operation assumed the system would absorb the impact. And for a while, it did. Until it didn't. Once soil structure is compromised, everything else becomes harder. Water infiltration drops, root development narrows, nutrient efficiency declines. So inputs increase, not because farmers want them to, but because the system demands them. This is not a failure of knowledge. It's a failure of incentives. Optimization rewarded output, not margin. Margin is what allows systems to operate imperfectly and still function. Biological systems rely on margin. Remove it, and they require constant correction. That correction feels like control. But it's actually dependence. The same pattern appears everywhere. Crop diversity. Diverse systems distribute risk. They interrupt cycles. They stabilize outcomes. But they complicate management. They reduce predictability. They resist standardization. So they were sidelined. Uniform systems scale better. They're easier to optimize. They're easier to finance. But they amplify shocks. One pest, one disease, one weather event affects everything at once. Resilience was traded for simplicity. Again, this didn't look irresponsible. It looked efficient. Then there's timing. Modern farming runs on tight sequences. Planting windows, application windows, harvest windows. Each step depends on the previous one being executed perfectly. This increases throughput. It also removes flexibility. Miss a window, and the entire chain degrades. Old systems absorb delays. Modern systems amplify them. That's not bad management. That's tight coupling. Tightly coupled systems fail differently. They don't degrade gradually, they cascade. One disruption propagates forward. Weather delays planting. Planting delays emergence. Emergence delays protection. Protection delays harvest. Each delay compounds. Yield-focused optimization doesn't account for this, because it assumes normal conditions. But agriculture doesn't operate under normal conditions. It operates under variability, and variability punishes tight systems. Another thing optimization ignored: human limits. Modern farming assumes near-perfect execution. Long hours, high cognitive load, constant decision-making. Precision demands attention, and attention is finite. When systems depend on flawless timing, human error becomes expensive. Stress increases, burnout rises, tolerance drops. But stress isn't measured, so it doesn't count. The system keeps pushing. This is where the narrative usually breaks. People say, farmers just need better tools. More data will fix this. Automation will solve the pressure. Sometimes it helps. Sometimes it tightens the system even more. More tools don't restore margin if the underlying design removes it. They just help you walk closer to the edge without falling, for a while. The deeper issue is this: optimization focused on outcomes, not conditions. It asked, what maximizes output? It didn't ask, what conditions allow the system to recover when things go wrong? Those are very different questions. And agriculture answered the first one repeatedly. That's why modern farms look impressive and feel fragile at the same time. High output, low tolerance, powerful, sensitive, efficient, unforgiving. None of this happened because someone made a wrong decision. It happened because the system consistently rewarded one type of success and ignored another. Over time, the ignored elements became liabilities. Soil that needs constant correction. Systems that only work under perfect timing. Operations that collapse under small deviations. At this stage, the system is still productive, but it's no longer resilient. And resilience is what determines survival. Which brings us to the turning point. Because once optimization removes too much margin, efficiency stops being an advantage. It becomes a trap. In the next part, we'll look at the moment when efficiency crossed that line, and how modern farming ended up locked into systems that demand perfection to survive. That's where the real risk lives. For a long time, efficiency looked like progress. It reduced waste, it increased speed, it made systems cleaner and more predictable. But efficiency has a breaking point, and agriculture crossed it quietly. The moment efficiency stops increasing resilience, it starts removing it. That's when optimization turns from advantage to trap. The trap isn't obvious at first. Because efficient systems perform extremely well under expected conditions. They deliver impressive numbers. They look controlled. They feel professional. The problem is what happens when conditions deviate. Modern farming systems are tightly coupled. That means every step depends on the previous one happening exactly as planned. Planting depends on soil conditions. Emergence depends on planting timing. Protection depends on emergence. Harvest depends on everything before it. Each link is optimized for speed and output. There's very little slack. Slack is inefficiency. Optimization removes inefficiency, so slack disappears. At first, this feels good. Less wasted time, less redundancy, more throughput. But slack is what absorbs reality. Weather doesn't respect calendars. Biology doesn't align with schedules. Markets don't wait for optimal harvest windows. Old systems absorbed these deviations. They bent. Modern systems don't bend. They amplify deviations. Miss a planting window by a few days and you don't just lose potential yield. You shift every downstream operation. Spraying windows tighten. Harvest overlaps increase. Logistics compress. The system becomes reactive instead of adaptive. Reaction is expensive. That's when costs start climbing. Not because inputs are abused, but because systems no longer forgive. Every correction becomes mandatory, and mandatory corrections accumulate. Another layer of efficiency, another dependency, another constraint, until the system feels like it's running itself. At that point, farmers aren't managing land. They're managing sequences. Sequences don't care about context. They care about execution. This is why modern farming feels mentally exhausting. Not physically harder, cognitively harder. There's less room for judgment and more room for error. Everything has to happen at the right moment, in the right order, with the right input. That's not resilience. That's precision dependency. Precision works beautifully when variability is low. Agriculture has high variability, so tension builds. This is also why bigger machines made sense. Larger equipment increases efficiency per pass. It reduces time per hectare. It fits optimization logic perfectly. But it also increases system inertia. Heavy machines compact soil faster than soil can recover. Large operations reduce flexibility. One breakdown affects larger areas. Again, this isn't stupidity. It's logical scaling. But scale magnifies fragility. Small systems fail locally. Large systems fail globally. When efficiency dominates decision-making, scaling up feels safer. More control, more output, more consistency. Until something breaks, then the consequences are bigger too. This is why modern farms often look powerful but feel tense. Everything works, but only if everything works. That's the definition of fragility. Another illusion efficiency creates is the feeling of control. Data dashboards, precision tools, predictive models, they reduce uncertainty on paper. But they don't eliminate it. They just narrow the margin for surprise. When systems are optimized too tightly, surprises don't get absorbed. They propagate. One delay becomes multiple delays. One error becomes multiple corrections. And corrections cost money. This is where margins disappear. Not because productivity dropped, but because tolerance vanished. High-yield systems with low tolerance are expensive systems. They require constant attention, constant adjustment, constant intervention. Efficiency promised simplicity. It delivered complexity. And complexity is manageable only when systems are forgiving. Modern systems aren't, so the workload shifts. From physical labor to mental labor. From execution to coordination. Farming becomes risk management. Every decision carries higher stakes. This is why the narrative of just optimize better fails. Optimization is already maxed out. What's missing isn't efficiency. It's room. Room for error. Room for delay. Room for recovery. Efficiency without room creates stress. Stress isn't just human, it's systemic. Stressed systems snap instead of bending. That's the moment efficiency stops being a competitive advantage and becomes a liability. And once systems cross that line, backing out becomes difficult. Because efficiency locked in the structure. Machinery investments, input contracts, operational scale, the system can't slow down without financial pain. So it keeps running, faster, tighter, more optimized. This is why so many discussions about agriculture feel circular. Everyone agrees the pressure is increasing. Everyone feels the system is fragile. But the proposed solutions are usually more optimization, more precision, more automation, more control. Those tools help, but they don't restore margin. They just help the system survive at the edge a little longer. So the real question isn't how to optimize better. It's how to change what we're optimizing for. Because if the target stays the same, outcomes won't change. That realization is where most people get uncomfortable. It suggests that the problem isn't execution. It's orientation. And orientation is harder to change than tools. In the final part, we'll step back and reframe the entire problem. Not to reject modern agriculture, but to understand what it actually needs to survive long term. That reframe is simple, and it changes everything. At this point, it's tempting to look for a villain. Technology, corporations, policy, markets. But none of those are the core problem. They're amplifiers. The real issue sits deeper. Modern agriculture didn't fail because it used the wrong tools. It struggled because it optimized for the wrong target. And once a system locks onto a target, everything else becomes secondary. That's the uncomfortable truth. Optimization itself isn't dangerous. Blind optimization is. Agriculture didn't ask the wrong questions by accident. It asked the questions that were easiest to answer. How much did we produce? How fast did we do it? How efficiently did we convert inputs into output? Those questions built modern farming. But they also narrowed its vision. Because no one asked, with the same intensity, how much stress can this system absorb? How quickly can it recover from mistakes? How dependent is it on perfect execution? Those questions don't fit cleanly into spreadsheets. So they were sidelined. Here's the key shift that needs to happen. Farming doesn't need to abandon efficiency. It needs to stop worshipping it. Efficiency is a tool, not a purpose. When efficiency becomes the goal, resilience looks like waste. Slack looks irresponsible. Diversity looks inefficient. But when resilience becomes the goal, efficiency is contextual. Sometimes speed matters. Sometimes margin matters more. The future of agriculture isn't about choosing between technology and tradition. That framing is lazy. It's about choosing which outcomes matter enough to optimize for. A resilient system doesn't maximize output every season. It maximizes survival across seasons. It doesn't chase perfection. It tolerates imperfection. That difference sounds small. It isn't. Systems optimized for survival behave differently. They accept variability instead of fighting it. They build buffers instead of razor-thin margins. They prioritize recovery over peak performance. These systems don't always look impressive, but they last, and longevity is the only metric that actually matters in agriculture. Here's the irony. Many of the tools blamed for today's fragility could be part of the solution. Data can reveal stress points instead of just yield gaps. Technology can restore margin instead of tightening systems. Mechanization can support flexibility instead of enforcing uniformity. But only if the target changes. If yield remains the dominant signal, tools will keep pushing systems toward the edge. If resilience becomes a signal, behavior shifts. Suddenly, diversity isn't inefficiency. It's insurance. Suddenly, slack isn't waste. It's capacity. Suddenly, lower peak output doesn't mean failure. It means stability. This isn't a call to romanticize the past. Old systems had limits too. Lower productivity came with real costs. But modern systems have shown their limits as well. And pretending otherwise only delays the adjustment. The hardest part of this transition isn't technical. It's psychological, because letting go of a dominant metric feels like losing control. Yield feels safe because it's visible. Resilience feels vague because it unfolds over time. But agriculture has never been about certainty. It has always been about navigating uncertainty. Systems that survive don't eliminate uncertainty. They absorb it. That's the reframe. Not, how do we produce more? But, how do we keep producing when things go wrong? That question changes design. It changes priorities. It changes incentives. It changes what success looks like. And once that shift happens, many current problems stop looking inevitable. They look like design choices. Choices that can be revised. Not overnight, not easily, but deliberately. Modern agriculture isn't broken. It's misaligned. And misalignment doesn't require destruction. It requires reorientation. The systems we built are powerful. But power without tolerance is fragile. If agriculture is going to remain productive in an increasingly unstable world, it doesn't need to be faster. It needs to be harder to break. That starts by admitting something uncomfortable. We didn't optimize farms for the wrong thing because we were careless. We did it because it worked. Until it didn't. And now, the cost of that choice is becoming visible. The question isn't whether agriculture will change. It's whether it will change by design, or by failure. Because systems that refuse to bend eventually snap. And agriculture has reached the point where bending matters more than breaking records. That's the real optimization challenge.